So, you're a moral psychologist?
I am, yes. That doesn't mean morally good. That means I study morality.
It's not a prerequisite to be morally good to study morality?
I mean, some people say the phrase research is me search, which I think means people study topics that they don't understand about themselves or something. And so in that case, I think maybe being a morally questionable person might make you more likely to be a moral psychologist. I'm not sure.
Oh no. How do you guys define morality anyways?
That's a good question. I think we try to just not define it because it can be too difficult. But I think basically it's questions of right or wrong, good or bad. What do and it's not just because these aren't objective problems. There's not necessarily an objective right or wrong. We study what people think is right or wrong and what people think is good or bad and what behaviors make people want to punish other people or want them to suffer some kind of punitive harm to the person who caused the harm.
So how is it possible to study all those things if there isn't a set place of what is good and what is bad that you're coming from?
You just have to talk about averages and attitudes and what people's perceptions are. So we can't make any claims of objective right and wrong. What we can say is all humans, or not all, that would almost never be the case. Most humans think, for example, murder is wrong in most contexts. Some would say it's okay in certain contexts, but for the most part, most people think murdering is bad. So that would be a sort of like average moral judgment, even if you can't say objectively, it's like an objective fact about the universe. I don't know, is murder wrong on your planet?
Well, it's interesting. Oh yeah, big time. So,
Oh yeah?
Oh yeah.
you guys know that murder is wrong, but you don't know why it's wrong?
We can know parts of why it's wrong. We know that people have evolved to judge people who pose threats to the social group and who pose threats to the self and one's kin. So if a person is a person who regularly causes harm to other people, that person poses a threat to you, to your family, and to your social group. And so unless they had a really good reason for it, like somebody was going to kill them, then we would think that person's somebody we have to look out for, that's someone we can't trust. And so we've evolved to basically judge those people, to hate those people, and sometimes to want those people to suffer, to be locked up, or in some cases even be put to death themselves.
But
Wow.
not in all cases, right? It seems
Not in
like
all cases.
it's possible to justify that.
Yes.
So
And different people would justify it different ways.
How do you justify it?
How do I justify murder?
Yeah, exactly.
I haven't had to yet, thankfully. So let's hope.
Don't do a lot of murdering?
No, haven't done any murdering in my day.
You kind of look like
and I'm
the type.
hoping to like make it through life without doing that. So
Good plan. So it seems like what you guys are calling morality sounds a lot like ethics on our planet, which is a sort of attention to the ecology around you, sort of taking care of your community and things like that.
Because we have a pretty simple definition of morality, and that has to do with violations of consent.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like if you
so
violate my
if somebody
consent.
wanted to be murdered, then it would be okay.
There'd be a lot of paperwork involved, but yeah.
I see. Okay.
Yeah, it's bad to violate someone's consent. That's it.
Okay.
Keeps it clean.
What if two people's consent comes into conflict? Then what?
Can you give an example?
Let's say one person. Well, I guess this wouldn't be an issue of would it be an issue of consent? Let's go with it. Let's say one person, their whole life's happiness is listening to their music really, really, really loudly in their house. They like it on full blast all through the night. And their neighbor wants quiet. How do you resolve that conflict? Is one person wrong and one person right when it's a conflict of interest?
Soundproofing.
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 Yeah,
A
so
perfect
law.
vacuum.
Who has to pay for the soundproofing? The person who wants their music loud or the person who wants it quiet?
Ah, that's a good question.
So this is what our courts just spend a lot of time figuring out.
Yeah.
There's
who
always
does
these
the
fine lines that
soundproofing?
need negotiated, particularly when there's conflicts of interest.
Mhm.
But that's what the legal system seems to be for, right? Is the ability to negotiate who pays when there's some moral issue that's not necessarily raised to the level of criminal issue, right? Isn't that what small claims court is?
I think so. Yeah. I think it's when they're nonviolent sort of disagreements about who had what obligation to do what, and then who owes who money or whom. Yeah. It
And
sounds like you guys have a really good system in place. I'm impressed.
well, we wouldn't get to outer space without it, you know?
That's true. That's true.
So
Why did you decide to study this?
Yeah, so I really got into morality by way of studying belief in free will. So and it was sort of random how I stumbled into it. I was taking a stats class, and I was using a free will data set, and I was finding that people's beliefs in free will were correlated with their desires to punish people, which just means that people who believe more in the concept of human free will also want to punish people more on average. Um,
whoa.
and so, yeah, and so I was also working with someone who looks at motivated reasoning. So I kind of looked at the reverse process. Like, is it not only the case that people who believe in free will, who think people are sort of more responsible for their behavior in their life, do they want to punish people more? But is it possible that when people want to punish people more, they actually increase their belief in free will? Their belief in free will partially is motivated by desire to hold people morally responsible. Because whenever a person administers punishment toward another person, now they have caused harm and they could be subject to judgment themselves. So let's say I think my neighbor is a bad person and I want them to suffer, so I go slash his tires on his car to get back at him. Well, people then might judge me, but if I can say, no, he's a horrible person and he deserved it, then they might not punish me. So people have to justify the punitive harm that they bring on other people. And one way they can do that is by saying, this person's a bad person. This person freely chose to do this bad thing, and therefore they deserve the suffering that we're now going to bring upon that person who caused harm in the first place. Does that make
Wow. That's very vengeful.
sense? It is vengeful. It is vengeful, but I think it's sort of a natural human impulse that evolved for good reason. So I don't know if creatures on your planet are the same, but here people are shaped by punishment, and not only just punishment but also social judgment. So when other people dislike a human, that human wants to change their behavior because they don't like to be disliked. So we've evolved to want to punish people and to blame people and morally judge people, because that's an effective way to shape other people's behavior so they become better citizens in the future.
But what if-
Enforced ethics.
But what if you're
Mhm.
pushing them towards something that doesn't actually make them a better citizen?
Like what?
Well, like, let's say you live in a place where lynchings are common, and the thing that everybody pushes everybody else towards is some terrible, terrible thing that they do to Black people.
Mhm.
What do you do then?
Yeah, it's not a perfect a lot of it would be shaped by the norms of the time. So at different points throughout history, different things would be considered acceptable, and then that would be what is considered in the best interests of people at the time. So people tend to punish um on we have like certainly evolved certain like moral preferences, like an aversion to harm is probably the biggest one. But certain harms can be justified depending on the culture, depending on, who is in power. um so it's not that clean, right? It can vary. So yeah, it is possible that there would be a norm in place where the behavior people are reinforcing, even though it's consistent with what they think is acceptable and tolerable and good, it's not what let's say modern people would say, and what people today would say is morally good, which is why it's so hard to answer the question, because perceptions of like moral goodness change over time.
Do they though? Because there were people back in the day of lynchings that were going around and saying that that was a bad idea and that it was immoral, right?
Yeah, it's more, I guess it would be more, how wrong is it perceived to be on average by what percentage of people, and to the extent that they're willing to accept costs to enforce those norms, or avoid benefits to do so. So yeah, like I mean, there might be cases when there were behaviors that people, I mean, like same-sex marriage would be a good one in the United States, and other places around the world. It used to be this perceived as morally wrong to engage in same-sex sexual relationships. And now, for the most part, people think it's fine. It's not even really a moral issue anymore. People have a hard time seeing it as a moral issue, but it used to be perceived as a moral issue. Now, that's not to say all people thought it was wrong, or that all people thought it was really wrong. It's just to say that on average, moral preferences can shift over time.
And in the case of something like that, it seems like it could be informed by the shifting environment. Like,
Mhm.
humans have plenty of humans on Earth, so maybe reproduction isn't the biggest priority in an intimate relationship anymore. But at some point, ethically speaking, if you wanted to tend to the survival of your community, it was necessary to enforce that kind of ideology.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. So it could be, if reproduction is more important for the survival of people, then they might say that it's more morally wrong. I think there are lots of different theories about how we came to be more tolerant, and I mean there are even relatively rapid shifts. But it might be that the the potential to not judge same-sex relationships as morally wrong was there, and you just needed the right environment in order to reach that potential that was already there. Um,
Well, this
but
seems like the rightness or the wrongness is there all along, and the thing that changes is consensus, is the way the tribe
mm,
swings.
yeah, shifting consensus, shifting how much people care who are part of different sides. So if one side cares more than the other side, they might be able to move people with them, especially if they're willing to pay bigger costs, in order to shift those norms. That could happen. Yeah.
I always think about this on Earth right now about people that eat animals, where
Mm-hmm.
it's one of those things that is exactly as you say. There's a huge cost to changing that preference or that tendency.
Mm-hmm.
And are there other places where this sort of pending shift in morality is quite so clear cut?
What do you mean? Do you mean other domains besides animals,
Yeah, because
or
I
do you
think
mean in?
that eating animals is something that very quickly, when there's a viable alternative, like humans are trying to grow meat inside of laboratories, right? You can get your
Mm-hmm.
chicken nuggets or whatever without ever coming near a chicken.
Mm-hmm.
And when you can do that, and it's the same price as, the real deal chicken, then morality will probably quickly shift to say that, it's really immoral to eat animals.
Right. Yeah, that's actually you bring up something that's kind of related to the whole motivated cognition aspect of morality, which is that if you can, so people generally thought eating meat was okay. I mean, I think a lot of people try not to think about what happens to animals, because they don't want to think that they're like endorsing or supporting like some of the worst kinds of factory farming, but they still want their hamburger or whatever. So, but if we can change the culture, if we can make it so that, plant-based burgers and plant-based chicken nuggets and plant-based cheese and all of that, if you can make it so it tastes pretty similar, and you can make it so it costs roughly the same, a lot of the sort of practical barriers to adopting like a plant-based diet will have gone away. And then people might change their moral preferences. And it's not that the morality has changed, it's that it's easier to adopt that lifestyle, and then people justify their preferences with morality, because you can get like moral props, if you say, I'm not doing this because these chicken nuggets are just as good, I'm doing it because I'm a morally good person, and I care about the well-being of other creatures. And you can get kind of, you can get status and praise by proving to other people you're a good person. So you can use morality to justify your behavior in a way that makes you look good to other people, which people try to do all the time.
Why do you think that it's so hard to define what is moral in an objective way?
Um, because there is a value to it, and it sort of depends on human opinion. So it'd be really hard to convince a person who had no aversion whatsoever, who had no intuitive understanding of what it would be like to cause like suffering for another person. If they said suffering is good, suffering is positive, I think suffering makes everybody better. I mean, it's even hard to say because you're saying that they have to then have an intuitive understanding that better is better. Um, but if somebody disagrees with the valence attached to it, then you can't logically persuade them to agree that there's like an objective, morally correct thing to do. So I think that's why, um, because I think it really depends on the people having the discussion about what is right and wrong, having a shared intuitive understanding of morality. And fortunately, most humans do have a shared intuitive understanding. That, I mean, of course we disagree in a lot of things, but the murder one, most people generally think murder is wrong unless there's a really, really good reason for it. Um, and that's because humans evolved to find people who cause harm sort of repulsive, and to want to get rid of those people and kick them out of the group. So it might be harder for people, or I don't know what kind of creatures you are in your planet, but if you guys didn't have that same intuition and we had to live together on one planet, we might find maybe the pressures you faced and the pressures we face were different enough that we might have a lot of moral conflict and we wouldn't always agree on what is good and bad. And then that could create all kinds of problems. And you would be saying, we should go to prison. And we'd be saying, you should go to prison.
Well, it's interesting because it seems like it would put the interpreters of good and bad in a very powerful position. And in this day and age on Earth, it seems like the priests have sort of lost their traction in that position and the scientists have sort of taken over. So you're perhaps in a very powerful position, Dr. Clark.
I don't want to be in a powerful position. I think there is, yeah. So historically, religions and religious leaders had a lot of power in defining what was acceptable, and people could get punished for violating the church. And you're right. Now we try to base punitive decisions on some kind of like objective facts, and we've tried to think about like, okay, was anybody harmed? But a lot of it would probably just date back to certain norms that have existed for a long time, um, that never went away. But yeah, you are right that science can influence a lot of um, legal decision making, and in the future it will be interesting to see how like different scientific advances affect how we punish. You know Sometimes in legal decision making, people will take certain things into consideration, like if you have a mental health issue that wouldn't have been understood hundreds of years ago, and now that it is better understood, it might be taken into consideration, and it might mean we don't punish someone and we get them help instead. But you could say the same thing now for, okay, we understand addiction better. We understand the way genes interact, not fully, but the way genes contribute to human behavior. And as we come to understand more of what causes human behavior, if we have like a more mechanistic understanding of human behavior, it could make people, I think, less punitive over time. Um, and I even think we're starting to see that now because there's so much concern about criminal justice reform, and criminal justice reform tends to be in the direction of let's ease up let's give people more opportunities to rejoin society. Let's help people reintegrate rather than, let's just lock them away for 50 years. So I think it's quite, and this is consistent with some of my own research, where, my favorite study of this bunch was it was students in a neuroscience class, and from the first day of class to the last day of class, they became less punitive toward a person they read about like a trial, a person who murdered someone, I think. But I think,
Why did they become less punitive?
Yeah.
we think it's because they came to have a more mechanistic understanding of the human brain. So they came to think of, so, you learn more about like what is happening in the brain, and it kind of like, it almost takes away like, we said it was because, sorry, I'm saying multiple things at once, but part of it was people came to believe in less in free will. But what I think that really means practically for people is they view humans less as these sort of autonomous, free-floating agents that choose their own decisions, and come to understand humans more as like the complicated creatures that they are, that are influenced by all these different things in their environments and their brains.
So they
And
sort
it
of
seems
acknowledge
to-
this structural weight that's going on. Like there's a big piece of material interaction going on here. Like humans aren't all spirit anymore. There's sort of some sort of hardware biology going on.
and hardware and biology that they don't get to choose themselves, and they have no control over. And
Gotcha.
so I think that messes up people's intuitive understanding of, moral behavior, where you want to say someone did something bad because they chose to do a bad thing, and not because they have some weird thing going on in their brain that they didn't choose.
Is there
So,
a
yeah.
worry that the science that this is based on is being produced by people that are tribalistic or biased or one-sided somehow? Because the outcome seems positive, right? In this case, where you have a group of people that come to understand the mechanics of the brain more clearly, they become less punitive, less vengeance in the world seems like a net positive, right? Everybody's happy. But what if it was science that said something different, that led them to a worse conclusion? Is that a risk?
So I'll say two things to that. Well, one is that it's always a risk, and I do think scientists have a really hard time pulling out their own values when they're understanding data and they're forming narratives around observations. I think in the case of the free will one, so you say it's a positive thing, which is interesting because that maybe tells me something about the culture that you live in. Because you could argue it's a negative thing if you were to, if we could find out, let's say, as we come to understand human behavior better, we become less punitive as a society. We're thinking, okay, less punitive toward the person who did this, whatever thing that they got punished for. But if becoming less punitive as a society makes people more likely to offend in the future, now I'm not saying that's true. I don't think we know for sure how that would. We don't know the long-term consequences of certain kinds of criminal justice reform, or certain ways we could change punishment. But it is possible that it could have negative consequences.
Sure.
So, and I do think that scholars have motivations. And even when I talk to different people about this, I can sometimes kind of tell like what their preferences are based on how they interact. Like if they're like, oh, that's so good, people are less vengeful. Vengeance is awful. We should get rid of vengeance. Or if they're like, well, that could be bad because we can't have sympathy for people who are causing harm, because then they'll keep doing it, and then it'll harm all these innocent people who didn't do anything wrong, and they'll be victimized. And
Is there an
those kinds
objective way to examine that? Is there an answer to be had?
The objective way I try to answer it is by saying what happens, and not by saying whether it's good or bad. But it might be good or bad. And if we had better data, we could answer that. So if we could show, if we reduce punishments in this way, or if we have this alternative, like a rehabilitation sort of alternative to these punishments, and people are no more likely to reoffend, and they're better off, they're able to reintegrate into society, they're able to get jobs, take care of their families, and no more innocent people are suffering or being harmed as a result of this, then I think we would say objectively it's a good thing based on what we've agreed are good things. And we've avoided bad things that we all agree are bad things. But that, of course, gets really complicated. So
Some of that's been tried, right? There must be some nations, I believe there's some nations on Earth that are trying less vengeful strategies for rehabilitation.
yeah, there are, and there's a philosopher, Greg Caruso, who looks at a lot of this, and his belief is that, well, when we don't have free will at all, and therefore moral responsibility doesn't make any sense. And think I'm mostly in agreement with him on that.
Oh, wow. We should
But
talk about that in a second.
but he thinks that, we should get rid of retributive punishment altogether. And I think maybe we should do that, but I'm not 100% sure yet. I don't know that the data are there yet. And then also I worry now I don't think this is possible, but if it was possible to get people to no longer morally blame people, to no longer morally judge people, again, don't think it's possible, but if it were, I don't know that that would be good for society, because shame and guilt are really effective ways of keeping people from doing sort of selfish things, not necessarily anything horrible, but selfish things that they might want to do otherwise that they don't do because they don't want to feel they don't want to be morally judged by other people, and they want other people to like them.
Sort of selfish and jeopardizing someone else, it seems like. Like selfish in a way that's zero sum or is actually affecting your neighbor negatively.
Exactly. It can be selfish in a way that harms other people. And so I would want to know that we could get rid of that and that it wouldn't cause a lot of people to suffer before I would be like, let's get rid of it. We evolved it for a reason. And that's because it works. It helps communities function, but maybe we don't need it anymore. Questions to ask.
So before I want to hear your ideas on free will, but before we go there about your own perspective on the matter per se, perhaps could you fill us in on why it's such a big deal? Like, why do humans care so much? How is this concept being weaponized politically? What's up with free will? Why is it such a big deal on Earth right now?
It's been a big deal on Earth for like a long time. The term free will wasn't always used, but I think people started sort of debating the extent to which people, and the arguments vary in their sophistication, but the extent to which people are sort of free to choose their own behaviors in their lives, free of any sort of external constraints that people don't have control over. So people define it in a couple of different ways. The one that I think is maybe the most interesting, although also I think is the one that doesn't exist, is just, can people at a given point in time, if they're the exact same person, they have their same genes, they live in the same world, they had their same upbringing, up until the moment they make a decision, could they do one of two things? Or would they just do the one thing that they were going to do? And I think in order so free will is supposed to be this thing that imbues humans with like moral responsibility and personal responsibility. And so I think you'd want to think, if a person could do one of two things, they would be doing that thing for a good reason, right? Because we want to say, no, you chose that, you're responsible for that. But in that case, they can't have any good reasons for doing one of two things, because everything has to be the same right up until the moment they make the decision. So it either has to be like a random thing, or it has to be, I'm not explaining this very well. Like either a decision has to be chosen, or it has to be random. And if it's chosen, then it's chosen based on that person's internal thoughts, which arise from it's a product of their past and who they are as a person. Um, so it's dependent on the past in a way that kind of gets rid of free will. And if it's random, if it kind of gets rid of free will too. But people have been thinking about it for a long time, and I think the reason they care about it is because they care so much about responsibility, and they care so much about moral responsibility, and it really matters to people to preserve this concept. And that's my experience as well. If I talk to people about free will, a lot of the time, and I say it doesn't exist, a lot of the time they'll get really worked up because they feel like they have free will and they feel like other people have free will. And there seems to be this sort of attachment to it. And so I think that's why we've been debating it for so long, and why we continue to debate it for so long, because it's tied up with all of these concepts that are so important to humans, which are responsibility and morality.
So if I understand you correctly, what you're saying is that the argument for there not being free will is that at a moment of a choice, there is a collection of events that have happened in the past that have led the decider to this moment.
Mhm.
And in that moment, that collection of events will lead them to make a decision that cannot be different from the one that they have made because it is involved with everything that's happened before.
Yes, I think that is probably a better way of phrasing what I was trying to say. And if they don't do it in accordance with everything from their past, that would lead them up to that moment and what they think is a good decision. Um, then it would be kind of like flipping a coin, right? It's like I'm not doing this based off of all of the knowledge I have accrued and all of my life experiences. And you can kind of date the causal history of people's lives back. Everything is caused by something that happened before it, and you can date people's causal histories back until before they're born. Or it's not caused by something that happened before it, and then that means it's not caused by something, which means it has to be random. It comes from nowhere.
Why couldn't it come
Um,
from their spirit or their own self?
well, that's part of why I think people have an attachment to free will for themselves, is because they believe in a sort of self, and it's a sort of self-made self. Um, but I don't think that really makes sense unless it's sort of coming out of nowhere. Because what caused your spirit or yourself? Or is nothing causing it?
So this is kind of interesting to me. I don't know. The way that we think about this on our planet is we break up this concept of free will into a few
Mhm.
chunks. So it's interesting because it seems like on Earth it's like yes or no, free will or no free will. But on our planet we think about it like there's strategic will and then there's tactical will. Like
Okay.
think about like your giraffes, for example. They got big long necks. They're probably going to eat leaves. Doesn't really matter. They can't do much about it. It's this strategy they're born into. I think Darwin would probably have something to say about this. But once they get their face up in the trees, they can pick the tastiest leaves. Maybe they like to eat the red leaves. Maybe they like to eat the blue leaves. I guess you don't have blue leaves on your planet. But
We do not.
there's like a sort of tactical decision making that happens at the level of the individual, which is somewhat unique and opens up the animal to making good choices, bad choices, serving their future interests or not, taking care of their present over the future, those kind of things. So it's very much a continuum instead of this, yes, you have a choice or don't have a choice. Why do you think humans have such a hard time looking at it as a spectrum?
So people do look at it as a spectrum, and a lot of people would say that free will can exist on a spectrum, and I would say that something related to like responsibility can be thought of on a spectrum, like doing something with a gun held to your head versus doing it without a gun held to your head. Um, Even though in both cases, like a person who has a gun held to their head feels compelled to do something because they evolved to not want to die. Um, And so that forces them to do things to avoid dying. Whereas a person who doesn't have a gun held to their head is not constrained by that fear of dying in the moment and chooses to do what they do for a different reason. They're eating because they're hungry, and they evolved to eat food when they're hungry. So even though you're sort of like compelled by your nature, and compelled might not be the right word, but your behavior is the result of your nature and your environment. I would still say that we should treat people differently. We should treat their behavior differently if they have a gun held to their head versus if they don't. Um, and so that is a continuum of responsibility. I wouldn't say it's a difference of free will, um, because in both cases, it's in both cases the behavior is caused. It's caused by something that we consider sort of like exonerating, having a gun held to your head, and something that we would say is less exonerating. So I'd take your distinction. A different giraffe might choose different leaves, but all giraffes would probably have a preference for like maybe the biggest leaves because they're the most nutritious and they get the most calories from them. And um, animals would have a preference for getting more calories over less. Um,
Some
and
of
maybe
them,
one
maybe they
giraffe
just do
is
it for the
taller than
taste.
another. Yeah, maybe the giraffe has different giraffes have different preferences, but again, they don't choose those preferences, right? I don't know why I love pizza so much. I just do. um,
Mm.
and I couldn't choose to not love it. Like it's part of who I am.
You don't think you
Um,
could reason yourself out of that preference?
I could try, but I would have a reason for trying, which would be I don't think it's healthy for me to eat so much pizza.
Hmm.
And I have other goals in my life, like wanting to not be morbidly obese so that I can, move around as easy as possible. Um, and so I would have conflicting goals, and then those goals could conflict in a way where I can try to convince myself I don't like pizza. Now, maybe I'll be successful or maybe I won't, but I certainly could try. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think I see where you're coming from because I think about this a lot where it feels like humans on a society level go through these cycles that seem inevitable. And it seems like there's very little ability to escape the cycle once it starts. For example, what happened over the course of the last few election cycles in the United States. For whatever reason, we study the United States a lot.
Mhm.
And it seems like you have a president in office that half of the country really dislikes, and the other half of the country really likes. And you begin to have this back and forth of those who dislike him yelling about the fact that they dislike him. The people who like him respond in an equal and opposite way. And it's a pattern, it's a dance that seems to have been written almost before it started. And the outcome of it almost seems inevitable. It's just another turn in the cycle, right? So there's a different president in the office now, but none of these problems have gone away.
Mhm.
None of the ugliness has been resolved. And it seems like it'll just continue, inevitably.
Yeah, that's human dynamics on a group level are slightly different than an individual level, but they are still predictable in the sense that we can understand aspects of human nature. Um, and then humans will tend to do the things that are in their nature to do. So in the case of like politics, political disputes, I'm fairly certain that people who care about politics and who identify with a particular political party, that they are going to continue to be part of their separate parties. They're going to continue to dislike each other. Both groups are going to continue to be sort of unfair to one another in relation to how they treat people in their own group. And they're going to um, frame reality in ways that portray their group better than the other group. And they're both going to do this, even when they're looking at the same piece of information. And even though I couldn't predict what an individual is going to do, I couldn't know what, Bob is going to do necessarily. I can predict what the groups are going to do because this is what they do. And this is now something could happen that could change that suddenly that we couldn't predict, or even something we could predict. Like if, we went into like a really intense war all of a sudden with a different country, that might change things in sort of unpredictable ways. But short of something extreme like that, um, yeah, human behavior tends to be human behavior.
How is it that you can't predict what Bob is going to do, but if you take 10,000 Bobs, you can predict what they're going to do? I don't understand that.
Yeah, so it's about averages and probabilities, right? So I can't, like, if I have 100 people and I know that, like, I'm trying to think of like what would be a good example for this sort of thing. Let's just say, there's something called in-group favoritism. So people are kinder toward people in their in-group than toward people in their out-group. I know that if I give everyone on team A $5 and I say split up the money between someone else on team A and someone else on team B, I know that because on average people are kinder to their in-group than their out-group, that on average team A is going to be given more money than team B. But I can't know who in that group is going to do it. I can only know that people do this on average, and so it is very likely to happen on whole. Some people in that group will actually split the money evenly. Some people might even give more to team B than team A. Those would be outliers. So those are sort of unusual people. And it's hard to now, if I knew a lot about a person, if I knew that this person is really in-groupish and they always show preferences for their in-group over their out-group, I might predict what they're going to do in that situation. But short of that information, I can make predictions based on averages because I understand human behavior on average, even though those averages don't apply to everyone.
So this leads us to a
everything's on a spectrum.
fascinating next question, where if everything's on a spectrum and we're working just with averages, what happens in a world where you start to know more and more and more about people's past behavior, right? So you have the tech world that is basically collecting reams of information on all kinds of people. And so this ability to predict must be getting stronger, right?
I think that's almost certainly correct. And it is probably being used, not probably, it is being used in various ways. So Facebook probably has a pretty good idea of what kinds of things it individual users like. Like it might know, oh, this person wants to take a Hawaiian vacation, and therefore they're likely to rent an Airbnb in Hawaii. And so they would be really good at predicting individual behavior and tailoring advertisements and other things, well, mostly advertisements probably, to those people. So yeah, and an organization that collects individual information like that will get better and better at understanding what individuals are likely to do and how to use that information to push them in the direction that they want to push that person.
Now, do the scientists have access to all that data too?
So my understanding is that there have been some controversies surrounding that. So there have been cases where data have been shared with scientists when they weren't supposed to be, and they got in trouble. Now, Twitter data, for example, a lot of that, because Twitter profiles are public, a lot of that data can be downloaded and it can be used to profile people, sort of like their personality. So you can download all of someone's tweets and then you can do a word analysis and you can say, this person seems to be quite extroverted, they're very verbal, they talk all the time about this topic, so they really care about this topic. So it could be available not only to scientists, but to people in general.
And
It
Google,
could be a
these companies are very interested in having scientists work on these projects, I imagine. I mean, for their own marketing interests, at least.
Yeah, and they do have their own teams of people who study their users and learn how to tailor things to them better. And so a lot of people are concerned about privacy issues and what these companies know about them and what are these companies doing with that information that might be um, nudging their behavior without them even realizing it. Now, some people don't care because they're like, oh, I get advertisements for things that I wanted to buy, and now I don't have to go shopping for them. It just pops up on my feed and I can buy it. But other people feel like it's very intrusive, and that can be understandable too. And then where do you draw the line?
So it
How
seems
much
like
information?
psychologists would be in high demand both for marketing and for politics.
They are. A lot of these companies hire people I went to grad school with. They work for Google and Facebook and, all of those companies. So they are, but it's really about statistics. You don't even necessarily need to know too much about the psychology to look at relationships between variables. And that's really what they're interested in. How do all of these variables interact with all of these other variables? And you can learn things just by looking at mathematical relations between things without even really understanding why they would be related.
But you have
So
to pick out really carefully which variables you're going to look at, right?
that would help if you knew what you were looking for in advance. And it also would help you avoid making like false interpretations about variables that are linked for random reasons and not meaningful reasons. Um, so yeah, psychologists are uh, people who get their PhDs in psychology who have really good data skills are in high demand for those jobs. Yeah, not me though. I would be of no use to anyone.
Do you think that there are observable biases in the tech world and the way that information is being handled in terms of presentation to the user? Like you say, advertising is one way, but advertising could be, on balance, maybe it is a positive, you spend less time shopping, fine. But what about when it becomes an echo chamber where you start to hear other people echoing your own thoughts, which forces you into a more tribal mindset?
Yeah, so that is an interesting problem because you're right that basically like Twitter I think is one of the best to look at because people can click things so Twitter knows once you click something, okay, you're interested in that. If you like something, maybe you're even more interested in it. And if you retweet it, you're really interested in it. You want to share this, you want other people to know this information. And then they can learn over time the kinds of things, the kinds of people you like, the kinds of topics you like. And they give you more of that because it helps them more because they have more engagement. It's reinforcing everyone's behavior because they get people like their clicks and their likes and their retweets and new followers. So it's using humans' natural information approach sort of instincts in a really fast, quickly reinforcing way that's no longer natural. So, it would always be the case that people would gravitate towards certain information, but they lived maybe in a small community and they knew the people in that community, and some of the people in the community were people they liked and some they didn't like, and they had to deal with everyone. Now you can form these kind of like subgroups of people who think just like you, because in the whole world of people, there are going to be a lot of people who think very similarly to the way that you think, and you're going to be attracted to those people. And now you come to form this false impression that this is a sort of consensus view that everyone shares and everyone thinks the same way you think. And that can create problems because then people think anyone who disagrees with them must be a bad person, or they must be stupid, or they must not know anything. And they make these really negative judgments of people who disagree with them. Now, how And then there's another layer on top of that, which is that people have a sort of bias toward attending to negative information, which means negative information gets more reinforced, and people are more reinforced to share negative information, to talk about what they hate and what's wrong with everything. And that can also create these false impressions. So it's a problem in the sense that it can really warp people's perceptions of reality, which can cause all kinds. I mean, we saw like in the United States with the storming of the Capitol. It's not like these. Now, I don't want to speak to the motives of all of the people who stormed the Capitol, but presumably a large chunk of them thought legitimately that the election was stolen. And if you legitimately have that belief, their actions might not seem so extreme because, well, that is something you should be pretty upset about. Elections are really important. And they probably knew other people who shared those beliefs. In fact, they probably knew tons of other people who shared those beliefs. And so they seem so normal to them. And so it's pretty obvious to me that that can create problems. Now, is that Twitter's fault? That all it does is reinforce human behavior and the way it naturally occurs? Or is it the user's fault?
Is there anything that could be, do you foresee there being a solution that's possibly top down? Is that even possible? Like, could you humans reinforce a different paradigm where more heterodox interactions are encouraged instead of people being exclusively, it seems like it's an exclusivity thing. Like, it's not a problem that like-minded people hang out together. The problem is that they only hang out together. Mm-hmm. Something like that. Are there any solutions on the table on Earth?
I think there have been some studies that tried to add more sort of cross-cutting information to people's news feeds. I forget what platform this was on. And I think actually polarization, or I don't remember what the DV is, and I wish I could tell you who the author is, but I'm blanking on that too. But the point is, I think they found that it didn't help, and it might have even made things worse.
Wow.
One thing you see is that people actually will share cross-cutting information, but they do it to mock that information and say how stupid that information is. And so I think what you would need is not giving people opposite information. A study I would like to see done, and maybe I should do it myself, but
do it.
Would be let's give people more moderate information. Let's give people more like centrist. Like, don't fight extremism on one end with extremism on the other end. Let's promote nuance. Let's promote people who acknowledge positives and negatives of different ideas and policies and people. And
do you think that like the YouTube algorithms and the Facebook algorithms could lean towards that? Like, is that something that, let's say, the marketing firms that drive those interfaces are even interested in? Or are they just getting rich off of this polarization and they don't care?
Yeah, that's the tricky part, right? If it's beneficial to them to share this extreme content with people because it energizes people and it gets them to use their services more, and it gets them to click more so they can sell more expensive ads, it's hard to imagine asking them to do something like this. And so,
unless they're genuinely interested in stability over selling ads, right? Like, as soon as the mob is out there with pitchforks threatening to burn down their mansion, maybe they'll be interested, but it'll be too late or something.
Yeah,
I mean, I hope not.
Does Google have its own mansion?
Where Mr. Google lives?
Yeah.
Yeah, Mr. Google has his own mansion, I think.
Hopefully it's
nice.
fireproof.
I'm sure it is.
It probably is. And they're probably like a big fence and dogs and who knows.
I guess what I'm getting at is somebody's got to figure out a way to make money off of that paradigm. So somebody's got to be a Superman or Superwoman and really just figure out a way to make it profitable in addition to saving the world.
Make nuance profitable.
Make nuance profitable again.
Yeah, there you go. I think the way that I would like to see it done is to make nuance cool, so that people want that, and make sort of like centrism and being moderate and being kind of like calm and reasonable, make that cool so that people want to be that way and they get status for being that way. And then more people will click on that sort of thing. I don't know.
There's not a lot of pop culture that surrounds reasonable, cool, calm people. These aren't heroes really on Earth, are they?
Not so much. Yeah. Not so much.
And the people who
trying to think.
rise to the tops of organizations also are not particularly known for their calm demeanor and even-handedness, right?
Yeah, the problem is when you get someone, and I think about this with politicians, anybody who would want to be a politician and would put in that much time and that much of their personal life
They have to be crazy,
attaining,
right?
you have to be abnormal. You have to be,
You have to be.
You're not an average Joe. You're not.
I'm glad you
You're
agree.
At least a couple of
extreme
sociopathic
status seeking.
tendencies.
Sorry if either of you want to be president, but you have to be
No.
of I don't know if you guys have a president or prime minister or whatever, but
It's like jury duty on our planet. It's not a big deal.
jury duty.
It's like jury duty. Like everyone
So
does
nobody wants to be the leader.
Well, you only get to be the leader for a short amount of time. So
Okay.
there's a lot of
cycle
checks
through.
and balances. It's not. You still got to go to work. It's not a
But
4 years
but that's
off.
sort of like that's you're not taking advantage of expertise there. Like how do people get all the relevant information they need to do the job if they're only there for a short while?
So many committees.
Yeah, big
Mm.
coalitions, and it's a bureaucratic mess. But
You
it
have to
works.
listen to like a lot of podcasts before you go.
That's
to
actually our
office.
exclusive medium of operation.
Yeah.
We seeded the podcast revolution on Earth, and so it's been really good for us to learn about humans that way.
Nice.
Everyone's really old on our planet too. I think I'm like
Really?
500,000 Earth years old or something. Yeah.
500,000.
Everyone's kind of all or nothing. They just get it over with really quick, or they just keep living.
I see. So you have people die really young or they live for a very, very long time.
They can live as long as they want, basically.
Oh. And people decide to die?
Yeah, unfortunately, or for better or for worse. It kind of gets kind
So
of.
do you guys dealing with overpopulation?
Well, it's not a problem so much anymore because we've kind of uncoupled the rearing of the babies from individuals, let's say.
And from the planet itself, right? We have nursery planets, and we're spread
Oh,
throughout
nice.
multiple solar systems, so it
I've
works
got
out.
10,000 babies, so
I guess you would need to live a long life if you're going to be traveling that far because it would take you a while to get to the other solar systems to
you have
drop your
no
kids off.
idea. We've been trying to get to Earth for way too long.
Feels like forever.
So
I believe it.
My question kind of comes back to this idea of centrism and nuance. It feels like on Earth there is a huge desire to go towards extremes. And that's not just on social media, that's in research and in research findings and in reporting. You know, scientists are supposed to be the model organisms. They're supposed to be the model humans. What is going on in the halls of science? How are these people so human?
radical certainty being reported.
Radical certainty.
Science
Yeah.
is settled.
The experts
It is.
agree.
It is you just have to look at the incentives to understand this. So scientists, well, one, they're human, so they're vulnerable to similar psychological tendencies and similar incentives. And what scientists, just like a lot of people, want is sort of status, and they want esteem. They want people to think they're really smart and contributing a lot, because that's kind of the currency in the United States for how valuable are you as a person in terms of what are you contributing to society. And so you just have to look at what gets people status and what gets people esteem and respect, and usually that is making really surprising big discoveries, The problem with surprising big discoveries is that by the nature of them being surprising and big, they're also more likely to be wrong. Things that are surprising are surprising because they don't cohere with all the other knowledge that we have. And so scholars are incentivized to make mistakes in one particular direction, and that direction is toward exaggerating how big and how important and how novel and earth-changing this new finding is.
What's the
And so
solution?
we have a lot of problems. So one solution that's been implemented recently in my area in social psychology and other related disciplines is what's called the open science movement, where you just force people to make their predictions public before they run their study and say how they're going to analyze the data so that they can't, change the numbers and, try multiple analyses to report the data in the way that shows the biggest effect. One thing I'm trying to do, and I'm trying to turn into a norm, wish me luck, is to
You
get
got it.
people to participate, get people to participate in adversarial collaborations, which are getting people who disagree with each other to work together and say, this is how we would answer the question. If it turns out this way, I'm right. If it turns out that way, you're right. And do it together so they're keeping each other in check the whole entire time and not letting each other, you know, use methods that are most likely to confirm their hypotheses and make questionable decisions along the way.
That's a really good
I
idea.
think I think it's a good idea, and I think we can get I think if we can make this is what I'm talking about, making it cool. Like if we can make that cool and give people status and be like, people who participate in adversarial collaborations are the best scientists because they care about the truth. And they've proven this because they're willing to work with people who are going to check them at every stage of their research. And make that cool, then more people should want to do it. And then we should get closer to the truth, I think. And then slowly weed out these sort of extreme findings that are just incorrect and
I love
lead
that.
other researchers astray.
Are there topics that nobody wants to touch, though?
Yes. But people don't want to touch topics for different reasons. There are topics in the social sciences that are like particularly taboo. I'm in the process of running a study right now where I'm interviewing a bunch of scholars, and their people do report hesitation towards studying topics that um can get you in trouble if you don't phrase that are sort of sensitive. If you don't phrase things the right way or you don't ask the question the right way, um, then people will, you'll be kicked out of the community or um, so yeah, if you can't get people to work together who are willing to study the sort of controversial topics, that could be a problem. But usually when there's low hanging fruit, someone's willing to pick it, right? So
What are the controversial topics that people don't want to study?
So they tend to be related to race and gender, basically. So
Fur
to the
color.
extent that they're what?
Fur color.
Fur color, exactly. Well, you guys have an interesting thing going on because it seems that you have different fur color and you're different genders potentially. Are you lovers?
We don't talk about that in public.
You don't talk about
What
that
happens in
public.
space stays in space.
Very lonely up
Yeah,
here.
I don't know. Are all of the males white and all of the females black? No.
We haven't even thought much about fur color actually
Not
in a
too
while.
much.
It's been 1,000 years or something.
Are all of your species only black or white, or are there other colors as well?
Oh, we got all kinds of colors. We got purple,
Yeah.
we got red, we got green.
So that's interesting because that tells me nothing about what kind of environment you live in. Like normally, if you see a white creature, you might think, oh, maybe it hunts in the snow. Or a black creature, you might think maybe it hunts at night because you need to be camouflaged from predators. But maybe you guys don't have any predators, and that's why you have so many colors.
It's been a long time. We had to completely remake our atmosphere, and we actually moved our planet one time. It's just been
You
so
moved your
long
planet.
since
It's
we were.
impressive. That didn't throw off the orbit.
It was bad. It was really bad. Actually, when we got to the new solar system, we accidentally tugged one of the outer gas giants in towards the sun, and it cooked off.
Really
and
hot.
Yeah, it lost all of its gas. Kind of looks like Earth now, actually.
Did you go through like a mass extinction during that period?
We hid out underground.
We took all the
Oh,
animals
okay.
with us, and so we collaborate mostly with the animals. And there's not that many predators, and we have sort of the ability to choose the characteristics that we have, which is something
Oh.
that humans have been talking about for a long time. Of the ability to choose things for your babies.
Oh, I see. So is it like a genetic modification thing? Like you can have a boy or a girl and you can choose, is this going to be an extroverted baby or a not extroverted
Yeah,
baby?
exactly.
Okay, nice. So your parents chose for you guys to be how you are?
Yeah, they mostly choose that their babies look a lot like them, but
Yeah.
when you can just send them off to another planet, you can always try another time, get a
And when
few,
you
That's
have
true.
10,000 of them, you can kind of go through all kinds of iterations over a generation.
try it all.
You guys, yeah, I guess you live so long, so maybe you have 10,000. At what age do you stop reproducing?
Never.
At death.
Never.
When I get tired.
Wow, that's impressive. We don't have any creatures like that on Earth.
Maybe you will.
Maybe like jellyfish
you
or
will.
something.
Jellyfish?
Nematodes.
Yeah.
I mean, you guys could take over Earth and then, I mean, you guys are pretty smart and you seem to have your things together. You could come over and you could take over Earth and you could kill all the humans.
Ah! Too much responsibility.
We wouldn't have anybody to study then, and we'd get bored
That's true.
quickly.
I see. Yeah. It's good. You're high in need for cognition.
Studying
very
humans
lonesome.
gives us something to do since alpha Flacians haven't faced these problems for a long time.
I see.
And so it's kind of like seeing, are there multiple ways to pass through this filter, or is there just one way? Like, can humans find a different way forward than alpha Flacians? Perhaps we don't have all of the answers. We think we have the answers.
Plus, you guys have
Are
really
you
good
going to tell me
music.
what the answer is?
In like 10,000 years, probably, yeah.
In 10,000 years, you're going to tell us?
Yeah. Once you
But
make it through.
is that kind of evil? Because you're going to allow so much suffering to happen in the meantime while we don't have it figured out.
What was it that you said at the beginning? Suffering is good because it makes you grow?
Did I say that?
I think you said it was a possibility.
I think you said that maybe a sociopath thinks that way.
All right, so I had one last question. I want to know what you think is the biggest threat to your species in the next century or so.
Ooh, the next century. That's a good question. I was just reading about various threats to our species the other day, but mostly people were saying they were not likely. Like we could have a horrible disease, we could have like massive earthquakes, we could have aliens come. Now that I know that there's extraterrestrial life, I'm kind of thinking that might be the biggest threat.
Oh, come on, we're
Does the
totally
government
friendly.
know about you guys?
Not yet.
I did see our spaceship in the news the other day. That was not good.
Oh yeah. Be careful that when we don't know what an object is, we can get a little hostile.
This is true.
That's
this is
why we're
true.
making friends right now.
Yeah. I don't know if you're contacting the right people. I don't have that much power.
You're going to be a character reference when we get there.
Okay. You guys do seem very nice, so I will do my best to try to protect you, but
We appreciate that.
the government is rough. But other than if you guys are entirely peaceful, and you seem to be very peaceful, I guess I'm not. So by threat, do you mean like human extinction, or do you mean like a problem that could severely harm the quality of human life?
Yeah, let's go with like a civilization level threat. Something that would send you back to the Stone Ages, or at least undermine a lot of the things that you probably value in your civilization.
Yeah, I hate to do the thing that I'm studying is the most important thing.
It's okay.
But I really do worry about how quickly polarization's increasing and how hateful it has become, to the point that, at least in the United States, I'm very worried that we could face a kind of, and I don't know exactly what a civil war would look like in a country where the competing groups don't have separate territories, or at least they have separate territories, but they're intermixed all over the country. So I don't know what a civil war would look like, but I am very worried that there could be extreme levels of violence between political groups, and that our democracy as we know it, including our ability to peacefully elect new leaders, that could stop and not happen anymore. Now, I don't know what I'd put the odds of that happening. I'd like to think it's very small, but I started worrying about this I started worrying about it seriously about 5 or 6 years ago, and then it was almost kind of a joke in my brain, but I still was worried about it. And now it's become less of a joke and more of like, oh my gosh, I might have been right.
Yikes.
So I'm very worried. So if you guys could help us get along better somehow, that would be really helpful. If you guys could be the ones to make like nuance and reasonableness cool.
We're on it.
Yeah.
That's what we're here for. First, we have to understand you, though.
We'll be the outside force that humans can rally around.
But people say that that's as an enemy, and you guys don't want to be our enemies, I don't think. Although it sounds like you're way more advanced. So even if, like, we wouldn't want to mess with you guys, right? I don't think.
There will be an unspoken threat.
You definitely don't want to feel the blaster.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you.
Yeah, we've taken a lot of your time. Thank you so much, Dr. Clark.
Thank you. It was nice meeting you guys.
Do you have anything that you are really excited about that you're working on right now that you want to plug?
Where can people find you?
Well, I talked about the adversarial collaboration thing, which is the thing I'm sort of most excited about. So I'm starting an adversarial collaboration research center at University of Pennsylvania. I'm on Twitter. I'm hard Cory. It's like a play on the word I'm hardcore, but no one gets it. But it's spelled
I got it.
I am HARDCORY. Yeah, no, and just in general, I think what I like, if you want to be influenced by me at all, then be a person who thinks being a centrist or being moderate or being like appreciating the nuance and not hating your enemies and appreciating that your enemies are just different people who have come upon different information and might have ever so slightly different values. They're not bad people necessarily. So be nice to them. That's what I'm trying to promote.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
I like that.
All right, well, hopefully we'll get to meet you when we get to Earth. But take care until then.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.